Madison rejected the Alpha King's proposal for the third time. She refused his crown to keep her daughter safe from his violent world. Smith rode away into the freezing fog, believing his dark past had destroyed his only chance at peace. He never saw the tiny hand slip a charcoal note deep into his leather saddlebag. The uneven letters read, "Please try again. Mama is crying." Hours later, ruthless mercenaries cornered Madison in her dusty bakery. A rusted blade swung down toward her head. She shielded her little girl and waited for the end. Instead, the heavy oak door shattered into 1,000 splinters. The deadliest man in the realm had returned. The winter wind bit through the cobblestone streets of Oakhaven. Smith rode at the front of his royal vanguard. He had conquered 3 neighboring provinces before the first snow fell. Men called him a tyrant behind closed doors. To his face, they called him their king. He wore heavy chainmail beneath a dark wool cloak. His face bore the scars of countless battles. He trusted no one but the sword resting at his hip. Madison scrubbed the wooden counter of her small bakery. Her hands were cracked and raw from the freezing water. She watched the passing soldiers through a frosted window. Her life was an endless cycle of baking, cleaning, and surviving. She had buried her husband 4 years ago. Now she only cared about one thing in this brutal world. Her 5-year-old daughter sat by the dim hearth. Lily clutched a worn wooden doll in her lap. "Is that the scary man, Mama?" Lily asked softly. Madison hushed her immediately and pulled the curtains shut. She knew men with power brought nothing but grief to commoners. A sudden shout shattered the quiet morning. An arrow struck the stone wall right beside Smith's head. Chaos erupted in the crowded market square. Assassins threw off their peasant cloaks and drew rusted blades. Smith swung down from his panicked horse. He drew his broadsword in one fluid motion. He parried a fatal blow aimed at his neck. His guards scrambled to form a defensive ring. A second arrow grazed Smith's upper arm. Blood soaked into the dark fabric of his sleeve. He backed into a narrow alley to avoid the archers on the roofs. The alley ended abruptly at Madison's back door. Smith pressed his back against the rough wood. He breathed heavily while gripping his sword. He prepared to kill whoever came around the corner. The heavy wooden door behind him suddenly creaked open. Smith spun around with his weapon raised. He stopped mid-swing. Lily stood in the doorway. She looked up at the towering man covered in dirt and blood. She did not scream or run away. She reached into her patched apron. Lily pulled out a clean strip of white linen. She held it up toward his bleeding arm. "You are hurt," the child said simply. Smith stared down at the small hands, offering him comfort. Nobody had spoken to him without trembling in a decade. He slowly lowered his sword. He knelt on the frozen mud to take the cloth. Madison sprinted from the front room. She snatched Lily and pulled the child firmly behind her skirt. Madison stood between the imposing king and her daughter. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. Her hands shook, but her eyes were steady. "Leave this house," Madison said. Smith stood up to his full height. He easily dwarfed the fragile woman standing before him. He looked at the iron poker and then at her fierce expression. He saw no reverence or fear in her posture. He only saw a mother protecting her own. The clash of steel in the square began to fade. His soldiers had slaughtered the assassins. Heavy footsteps echoed at the mouth of the alley. 4 royal guards rushed forward with weapons drawn. Smith raised a single bloody hand to halt them. He did not break eye contact with Madison. He wrapped the child's linen strip tightly around his own wound. The scent of fresh bread filled the tense silence. Smith looked around the impoverished, drafty kitchen. He looked back at the woman who dared to threaten him. "Pack your things," Smith ordered. Madison tightened her grip on the iron poker. "Excuse me?" she asked. "You will come to the capital," he stated. He took a step closer to the threshold. "I have enough gold to feed you both for a lifetime," he continued. He pointed to the child hiding behind Madison's dress. "She will never wear rags again," he said. Madison did not drop her weapon. "And what is the price for this gold?" she asked. Smith met her defiant gaze. "Marry me," Smith said. The royal guards gasped in unison. Their king had never taken a wife or shown interest in courtly romance. He was offering a crown to a peasant in a dirty alley. Smith waited for her to fall to her knees in gratitude. He expected tears of joy and immediate submission. Madison stood perfectly still. She looked at the blood dripping from his armor. She thought of the violence that followed him like a shadow. She thought of the quiet, safe life she wanted for Lily. Madison lifted her chin. "No," she replied. The word echoed loudly in the cramped space. Smith frowned in genuine confusion. "I can give you the world," he told her. "You only know how to conquer worlds," Madison answered. She stepped back and prepared to close the door. "I will not let my daughter grow up in a slaughterhouse," she said. Madison slammed the heavy door in his face. She slid the iron bolt lock into place. Smith stood outside in the freezing wind. He stared at the wooden planks separating them. He touched the white linen tied around his arm. He had commanded armies and destroyed empires. Nobody had ever told him no. A strange feeling settled in his chest. It was not anger or pride. It was a deep, unsettling curiosity. Smith finally turned away from the door. He walked past his stunned guards without saying a word. He mounted his horse in the bloody market square. The king left Oakhaven that day, but he left a piece of his mind behind in that bakery. Smith sat on his iron throne in the capital. The great hall was silent despite the crowded court. Generals laid war maps across the heavy oak tables. Nobles whispered about trade routes and winter taxes. Smith did not hear any of them. He stared blankly at the roaring fire in the massive hearth. A stained white strip of linen rested in his pocket. He had kept the simple cloth instead of burning it. 3 months had passed since he left Oakhaven. He had crushed 2 rebellions and secured his northern borders since that day. His enemies feared his banner more than the plague. Yet he could not stop thinking about a drafty kitchen. He could not erase the memory of a woman holding an iron poker. He remembered the defiant fire in her eyes. He remembered the quiet bravery of her small daughter. He had offered them the protection of a sovereign. He had been dismissed like a common beggar. The rejection festered inside him like an untreated wound. It opened a strange abyss in his structured world. He abruptly stood up from the throne. The sudden movement silenced the whispering nobles. He ordered his commander to prepare a caravan. He was returning to the borderlands. Winter held Oakhaven in a brutal grip. Snowdrifts buried the cobblestone streets. Madison counted 3 copper coins on her wooden table. They were her only savings for the week. The flour sacks in the corner were completely empty. No merchants traveled the dangerous roads in this weather. Nobody in the impoverished town had coin to buy baked goods anyway. Lily coughed softly from the narrow bed. Madison hurried to her daughter's side. She placed a trembling hand on the girl's hot forehead. Lily was burning with a deep winter fever. Madison pulled her own thin shawl over the sleeping child. The hearth fire was dying down to embers. She had no firewood left in the shed. She had to make a terrible choice. She could buy a small bundle of wood or a single vial of medicine. She wrapped her threadbare coat tightly around her shoulders. She stepped out into the freezing wind to find the apothecary. The apothecary shook his head at her 3 copper coins. He told her willow bark was reserved for those who could pay silver. Madison walked back home with empty hands and a heavy heart. She felt the crushing weight of despair settling over her. A loud horn suddenly blasted through the howling wind. Heavy hooves shattered the frozen ice on the main road. Madison stopped in the snowy street. She watched a massive royal procession enter the town square. 10 heavy wheating wagons rolled past the local tavern. They were loaded with sacks of grain and thick furs. Armored knights rode alongside the valuable cargo. Smith rode at the front on a towering black warhorse. He wore a dark fur mantle over his steel plates. The townsfolk fell to their knees in the snow. Madison stood frozen in the middle of the road. Smith spotted her immediately. He steered his horse directly toward her. He looked at her blue lips and shivering frame. He swung down from his saddle. He unclasped his heavy fur mantle and threw it around her shoulders. The thick fur instantly blocked the biting wind. Madison flinched but did not push it away. "Where is the child?" Smith asked sharply. "She is at home," Madison answered through chattering teeth. "Show me," he commanded. Smith walked with her to the bakery. He stepped inside and felt the bitter cold of the room. He saw Lily sleeping under a pile of inadequate blankets. He heard the deep rattle in her small chest. Smith turned back to the open door. He shouted an order to his soldiers. 2 guards quickly rushed in with armfuls of dry firewood. A royal physician followed them with a leather medical bag. The physician immediately went to examine Lily. Guards began carrying sacks of flour and cured meats into the kitchen. They stacked the expensive food on the dusty shelves. Madison watched the chaotic scene in stunned silence. Smith stood in the center of her kitchen like a conquering hero. He watched the fire roar back to life in the hearth. He watched the physician pour a rare tincture into a cup for Lily. The room grew warm within minutes. "I told you I could provide for you," Smith said quietly. Madison looked at the sudden wealth surrounding her. She looked at her daughter resting peacefully with proper medicine. She felt a wave of profound relief wash over her. Then, she looked into Smith's dark eyes. She saw the quiet satisfaction of a man who had won a siege. He believed he had finally bought her surrender. Madison took a slow, deep breath. She unclasped the heavy royal mantle from her shoulders. She folded the expensive fur and placed it on the counter. "Thank you for the medicine," Madison said. She walked over to the stack of flour sacks. "I will repay you for the food and the doctor's time," she added. Smith frowned at her formal tone. "You owe me nothing," he stated. He took a step toward her. "I came here to ask you again," he said. "Come to the capital and be my queen." He gestured to the warm fire in the sleeping child. "You will never have to beg an apothecary for bark again." Madison stood straight and looked him in the eye. "You do not want a wife," she told him. "You want a pet." Smith tightened his jaw in frustration. "I am offering you survival," he argued. "You are offering a gilded cage," she corrected. She crossed her arms over her thin dress. "You saw my weakness and used it to force a victory," she said. "You think this food and wood makes you a savior." She shook her head slowly. "It just makes you a wealthy merchant buying loyalty." Smith stepped closer until he loomed over her. "I could order my men to burn this town to the ground," he warned in a low voice. "I could take you and the child by force." Madison did not blink. "You could," she agreed calmly. "But you would only have my body." She pointed toward the heavy wooden door. "You would never have my respect." The silence stretched between them for a long time. Smith looked at the iron poker still resting by the fire. He looked at the fierce woman who refused to yield. He realized she was stronger than any general he had faced. He could not break her will with gold or threats. He slowly backed away toward the door. "Leave the supplies," Smith ordered his men. He did not look back as he walked out into the cold. He mounted his horse in the town square. The winter storm swallowed the royal caravan as they departed. Madison bolted the heavy door behind him. She sat by the fire and held her breathing daughter close. She had rejected the king a second time. She knew her quiet life in Oakhaven was over forever. Spring arrived in the borderlands. The snow melted into muddy streams across the cobblestone streets. Madison opened her bakery windows to let in the warm breeze. Lily played by the hearth with her faded wooden doll. A solitary rider entered the town square without a horn blast. Smith tied his horse to the wooden post outside the bakery. He wore no armor or heavy fur mantle this time. He wore a simple linen shirt and worn leather trousers. He had left his royal guards at the border. He had left his crown in the capital. Smith pushed open the bakery door. Madison dropped a wooden spoon in sheer surprise. She expected heavily armed soldiers or cruel tax collectors. She did not expect the king dressed as a common laborer. "I am not here to conquer," Smith said quietly. He walked past the counter and picked up a rusted axe resting by the door. He walked out to the woodshed without another word. Madison watched him through the dusty back window. Smith began splitting heavy logs with precise strikes. Sweat soon soaked through his thin linen shirt. He worked in silence until the woodpile reached the roof. He then climbed a ladder to fix the broken shingles on her roof. He did not demand gratitude or a hot meal. He simply worked. Lily walked out into the yard holding a tin cup of water. She handed the cup to the tall, intimidating man. Smith knelt in the dirt to accept a drink. His massive hands were incredibly gentle when he took the fragile cup. He thanked the child with a soft, rumbling voice. Madison leaned against the wooden doorframe. She saw a weary man hidden beneath the terrifying legend. Weeks turned into a quiet, peaceful month. Smith rented a small room at the local tavern. He visited the bakery every single morning at dawn. He swept the flour-dusted floors before Madison woke up. He carried heavy sacks of grain from the distant mill. He carved a small wooden wolf for Lily using his hunting knife. The little girl carried the toy everywhere she went. The townsfolk eventually stopped hiding when he walked down the street. Madison found herself looking for his broad silhouette in the morning mist. She felt a dangerous warmth growing in her chest. She knew she was standing on the edge of a steep cliff. One evening, Smith washed his hands in the wooden basin. The bakery was quiet after a long day of intense labor. Lily was asleep in the back room with her wooden wolf. Smith stood by the stone hearth and looked at Madison. The dim firelight softened the harsh scars on his face. "I have learned a great deal in this kitchen," Smith said. Madison wiped the white flour from her patched apron. "You learned how to knead dough," she replied softly. Smith shook his head slowly. "I learned what peace feels like," he told her. He took a slow step toward her. He did not crowd her or loom over her like before. He kept a respectful, cautious distance. "I brought you gold, and you called me a merchant," he said. "I brought you armies, and you called me a tyrant." He extended his empty, calloused hands toward her. "Today, I bring you nothing but a man." Madison stared at his scarred palms. "I will step down from the throne," Smith continued. Madison gasped at the impossible statement. "I will leave the crown to my generals," he said. "I only want to stay here in Oakhaven with you." He looked deeply into her anxious eyes. Marry me, Madison. It was his third proposal. It was the first one that sounded like a desperate plea. Madison felt a single tear slide down her cheek. She wanted to say yes and rest against his strong shoulder. She looked at the wooden wolf resting on the table. Then she looked at the deep blade scars covering Smith's arms. Those marks told a dark story of a violent past. A king cannot simply walk away from his shadow, Madison whispered. Smith stepped closer with a pleading look. I can, he insisted. Your enemies will never believe you, she said. She pointed to the scars beneath his rolled sleeves. The men you defeated will always seek their retribution. She thought of the brutal assassins in the alleyway months ago. She thought of Lily caught in a storm of burning arrows. They will track you to this quiet town, Madison said. Her voice trembled with unshed tears and rising fear. They will burn my bakery to the ground just to reach you. Smith lowered his hands. I would die before I let them touch you, he swore. And then we would be left alone in the ashes, she answered. Madison turned her back to him. She gripped the edge of the wooden counter to steady her shaking knees. I cannot risk my daughter's life for your redemption. She closed her eyes tightly against the pain in her chest. No, Smith. The rejection was much softer this time. It still cut him deeper than any enemy blade ever had. Smith stood in the quiet kitchen for a long, heavy moment. He realized his violent history was a prison he could not escape. He nodded slowly to her trembling back. I understand, he whispered into the shadows. Smith walked out the door and disappeared into the dark night. Madison sank to the wooden floor and finally let herself cry. She did not know that Lily was awake in the back room. The little girl had heard everything through the thin wooden wall. Smith packed his sparse belongings in the dark tavern room. The pale moonlight offered just enough illumination to see his saddlebags. He rolled up his spare linen shirt with slow, heavy movements. He did not sleep a single wink after leaving the bakery. Madison had spoken a painful truth. His violent past would eventually destroy her quiet life. He strapped his heavy iron broadsword to his waist. Leaving Oakhaven felt like tearing a vital piece of his soul away. He walked silently down the wooden stairs of the inn. The young stable boy was fast asleep in the hay. Smith began to saddle his black warhorse in the quiet shadows. He tightened the leather straps with practiced efficiency. Lily lay awake in her narrow bed across town. She heard her mother weeping softly in the next room. Madison tried to muffle her sobs with a thin feather pillow. The mournful sound broke the little girl's heart. Lily sat up and clutched her carved wooden wolf. Smith had made her mother smile for the first time in years. He fixed their broken roof and chased the bitter cold away. She knew who was leaving town forever. Lily climbed out of bed and crept to the small wooden table. She found a torn piece of rough parchment near the flour bin. She picked up a chunk of dark charcoal from the cold hearth. Lily could only write a few simple words. She pressed the charcoal firmly against the paper. Please try again. She paused and listened to another muffled sob from the bedroom. Mana is crying, she added below the first sentence. She folded the parchment into a tiny, uneven square. Lily opened the back door with extreme care. The freezing night air chilled her bare feet instantly. She ran down the dirt alley toward the local tavern. Dark shadows moved across the empty cobblestone street. She spotted the tall man preparing his horse in the distance. Smith turned his broad back to tighten the leather girth. Lily darted forward like a silent mouse. She slipped the folded note deep into his open saddlebag. She immediately retreated behind a stack of empty wine barrels. Smith paused and looked over his shoulder. He sensed a sudden movement in the dark stable. He only saw a stray cat darting across the hay. Smith swung up into the worn leather saddle. He steered his horse out of the sleepy border town. He did not look back at the bakery. Lily watched him ride away into the thick morning fog. She whispered a quiet prayer for his quick return. Morning sunlight eventually broke through the gray clouds. Smith rode steadily along the rugged mountain path. He put miles of distance between himself and Oakhaven. His chest felt hollow and completely numb. He stopped his horse near a shallow stream at midday. The cold water rushed over smooth gray stones. He dismounted to let the exhausted animal drink. Smith opened his leather saddlebag to find his ration of dried meat. His rough fingers brushed against a strange piece of parchment. He pulled the folded square out into the bright daylight. He did not recognize the clumsy folds. Smith opened the paper slowly. He stared at the uneven charcoal letters. The crude handwriting obviously belonged to a young child. He read the short message 3 times. Madison had rejected him out of deep fear for her daughter. She did not push him away out of hatred or indifference. She was weeping for him in that drafty kitchen. The sudden realization struck him harder than a warhammer. He had walked away like a defeated coward. He promised to protect them from his dark shadow. Running away did not guarantee their safety at all. It only left them entirely undefended. Smith crushed the note in his strong fist. A fierce fire ignited in his dark eyes. He threw himself back onto his warhorse. He jerked the reins and spun the massive beast around. Smith kicked his spurs into the horse's flanks. He galloped back toward Oakhaven at a breakneck pace. He would not accept defeat this time. Madison opened to bakery doors later that morning. Her eyes were red and heavily swollen from crying. She arranged the fresh loaves of bread with trembling hands. The town square felt terrifyingly empty without his presence. She told herself she made the only responsible choice. Lily sat quietly by the unlit fireplace. The little girl refused to eat her morning porridge. A sudden crash shattered the quiet morning. The bakery door slammed open violently. Cold wind rushed into the small room. 3 men stomped into the shop wearing rusted armor. They carried jagged swords and cruel expressions. Madison instantly recognized the worn crests on their dark cloaks. They were mercenaries from the defeated Northern Rebellion. Smith had crushed their army 3 months ago. Now they wandered the borderlands as desperate outlaws. The largest mercenary ticked a wooden chair across the room. He glared at Madison with a sinister grin. "We saw the king ride out of town alone," the man growled. Madison backed slowly toward the kitchen hearth. She desperately searched for her heavy iron poker. "He spent a lot of time in this little shop," another outlaw sneered. They noticed the fresh bread and the warm fire. They noticed the helpless woman backed into a corner. "Maybe he left some royal gold behind," the leader said. He drew his rusted blade with a harsh scrape. Madison pushed Lily behind her skirt immediately. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the iron poker with sweaty palms. "There is no gold here," Madison said firmly. Her voice shook despite her best efforts to remain brave. The leader took a heavy step forward. He knocked the fresh loaves of bread onto the dirty floor. "We will take whatever we want," he promised. Madison swung the iron poker in a desperate arc. She struck the leader hard across the forearm. The man howled in sudden pain and dropped his sword. His companions cursed and lunged at her. One outlaw grabbed Madison by the shoulder and threw her to the ground. The iron poker clattered listlessly across the wooden planks. Lily screamed and hit the attacker with her small fists. The man shoved the child backward into the dusty flour sacks. Madison scrambled across the floor to reach her daughter. The leader picked up his fallen sword with a furious roar. He raised the jagged blade high above Madison's head. She curled her body over Lily to shield the child. She waited for the fatal blow to fall. A thunderous crash suddenly echoed from the front room. The bakery door was ripped entirely off its iron hinges. The heavy wood slammed into the opposite wall and splintered into pieces. The mercenaries spun around in absolute shock. Smith stood in the ruined doorway. He blocked out the sunlight with his massive frame. His chest chafed with brutal exertion. His eyes burned with murderous fury. He did not wear his crown or his heavy armor. He only held a single broadsword in his right hand. The leader of the mercenaries took a terrified step back. He recognized the face of the man who slaughtered his entire army. Smith looked down at Madison bruising on the floor. He saw Lily trembling safely beneath her mother's arms. A terrifying silence fell over the ruined bakery. Smith locked his gaze on the three outlaws. "You have made a grave mistake," Smith whispered. His low voice rattled the remaining glass windows. He slowly raised his iron blade. The mercenaries froze under Smith's lethal glare. Absolute terror rooted their boots to the wooden floorboards. Smith moved faster than human eyes could track. He did not draw his weapon with a battle cry. He executed his judgment in terrifying silence. He swung his broadsword in a devastating arc. The kinetic force shattered the leader's rusted weapon into fragments. Dark shadows seemed to bend around Smith as he advanced. He struck the mercenary commander with the flat of his blade. The brutal impact launched the man backward through the front window. Thick glass rained down on the snowy street outside. The second outlaw panicked. He lunged forward with a clumsy thrust. Smith casually sidestepped the pathetic attack. He disarmed the assailant with a punishing twist of his wrist. The mercenary's arm snapped with a sharp crack. A mailed fist collided with the outlaw's jaw. The man collapsed into a heap of unconscious limbs. Smith crushed the fallen dagger beneath his leather boot. Only the third bandit remained standing near the destroyed counter. The man dropped his sword. He fell to his trembling knees. He begged for mercy in a broken voice. Tears streamed down the bandit's filthy face. Smith did not speak a single word of forgiveness. His sovereign authority left no room for clemency. He grabbed the weeping outlaw by his frayed collar. With effronting strength, Smith hurled the man entirely out of the doorway. The bandit tumbled violently into the muddy road. The survivor scrambled to his feet. He fled blindly toward the dark forest. Complete silence returned to the shattered kitchen. Smith sheathed his weapon with a metallic click. The malevolent aura surrounding him instantly dissolved. He rushed across the debris-covered floor toward the dark corner. Madison still knelt on the ground. Her arms were wrapped tightly around Lily. Her breath came in rapid gasps. She expected to feel the cold bite of a mercenary blade. Instead, she felt the sudden warmth of safety. Smith dropped heavily to both knees in front of them. He reached out with shaking hands. He meticulously checked them for injuries without crossing their boundaries. He scanned Madison's pale face for any sign of pain. "Are you hurt?" Smith asked in a hoarse whisper. Madison slowly raised her head. She loosened her tight grip. Lily peeked out from beneath her mother's protective embrace. The child was covered in white flour. She remained completely unharmed. Madison shook her head mutely. Tears streamed freely down her pale cheeks. She realized how close they had just come to total ruin. The harsh reality of the borderlands had finally caught up to her. Her fierce independence had almost cost Lily her life. Smith closed his eyes. He released a long breath of absolute relief. He leaned back on his heels. He reached into his leather pouch. He pulled out the crumpled square of rough parchment. He smoothed the crude folds against his hardened palm. Madison stared at the charcoal writing in utter confusion. She recognized her own bakery paper. She looked down at her daughter's hopeful expression. Lily offered a timid smile to the imposing king. "I found this near the mountain pass," Smith explained quietly. He held the note out for Madison to see. He looked deeply into her tearful eyes. "You told me my shadow would destroy this quiet life." He gestured to the broken door. He pointed at the ruined bread scattered everywhere. "You were entirely right about the danger." He leaned closer to her. "But running away left you defenseless against it." Madison wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the unparalleled strength radiating from him. The mercenaries would have slaughtered them without a second thought. Smith was the only reason they were still breathing. She finally saw the truth in his words. "My past will always follow me," Smith admitted honestly. He did not try to hide the dark truth anymore. "Men will seek their retribution against me until the end of my days." He gently took Madison's cold hands in his own. His touch was warm and incredibly grounding. "I cannot erase the violence I have committed in my reign." His voice carried the heavy weight of a solemn oath. "But I can become the impenetrable wall standing between you and the abyss." He brushed a stray lock of hair away from her damp face. "I will never let a single blade reach this family again." He pressed her small hands against his scarred chest. "I am asking you to let me stay." He looked from Madison to Lily and back again. "I am asking you to let me fight for you." Madison felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She saw the desperate vulnerability hiding beneath his formidable exterior. He was a king who commanded entire continents. Yet he was begging a ruined widow for a reason to live. The terrifying barrier of fear inside her finally shattered completely. She understood that his immense power was not a threat to her. It was the exact shield they desperately needed to survive. She realized she loved him for the man he was trying to be. Madison let out a broken sob. She nodded her head once. "Yes." Madison whispered into the quiet room. The single word carried the immense force of a binding covenant. Smith let out a sound that was half laugh and half sigh. The heavy burden of his solitary existence lifted instantly. He wrapped his massive arms around her delicate frame. He pulled her against his chest in a protective embrace. Madison buried her face into his broad shoulder. She finally let go of the crushing burdens she had carried alone for years. Lily tugged gently on the hem of Smith's linen shirt. Smith gently released Madison. He looked down at the little girl. He scooped Lily up with effortless grace. He settled the child comfortably in the crook of his heavy arm. Lily reached out and touched the hilt of his sword. She was not afraid of the deadly weapon. She knew it belonged to her protector. Smith covered her small hand with his large palm. He silently vowed to never let her see the horrors of war. "Did you bring your sword back?" Lily asked innocently. Smith offered her a rare smile. "I brought everything back," he promised the child. He stood up to his full height. He effortlessly supported both Madison and Lily against his sides. The harsh winter wind blew through the missing doorway. It did not feel cold or threatening to Madison anymore. She stood beside the most dangerous man in the realm. She had never felt safer in her entire life. Smith looked around the wreckage of the humble bakery. He knew they could not stay in this vulnerable building. "We are leaving Oakhaven," Smith declared with gentle authority. Madison did not argue or resist his command this time. She looked at the flour-dusted wreckage of her past life. She was completely ready to build a new one. "Where are we going?" Madison asked softly. Smith secured his arm around her slender waist. "We are going to a fortress built on a mountain of solid rock," he told her. He envisioned the impenetrable walls of his ancestral stronghold. No army in the world can breach its iron gates. He kissed the top of Madison's head. "You will have sprawling gardens that bloom in the winter." He smiled at Lily, resting securely against his chest. "And you will have a library larger than this entire town." The little girl's eyes widened with pure wonder. Smith carried them out of the ruined building. The townsfolk had gathered in the muddy street to whisper. They fell completely silent as the king emerged from the shadows. Smith ignored the frightened peasants. He spotted the town mayor cowering near the tavern. Smith gestured for the trembling official to approach. He tossed a heavy leather purse onto the frozen mud. "Repair the bakery," Smith ordered the mayor. "Give it to the poorest family in this miserable town." The mayor scrambled to pick up the royal gold. He bowed repeatedly to the king. Smith turned away from the gaping crowd. He walked toward his waiting war horse. His royal vanguard would arrive by nightfall to escort them. Until then, his blade was the only security they needed. The dark abyss of his past no longer consumed him. He had found his light in a forgotten border town. He would gladly burn the rest of the world to ashes to keep it safe. Madison leaned against his side as they waited. She watched the snowflakes land on his broad shoulders. The terrifying tyrant of Oakhaven was gone forever. He was simply a father and a husband now. The royal vanguard arrived to Oakhaven just before dusk. 50 heavily armored knights rode into the muddy square. They brought a massive wooden carriage reinforced with iron plating. The carriage interior was lined with soft velvet and thick bear furs. Smith lifted Madison and Lily directly into the warm cabin. He closed the heavy door to block out the freezing wind. He did not ride his black war horse at the front of the column. He sat inside the carriage with his sword resting across his knees. The journey to the capital took 5 exhausting days. The winter storms battered the wooden walls of their transport. Madison watched the harsh weather through the narrow glass window. She felt no cold or fear during the long trip. Smith kept the brass heaters filled with burning coals. He spent hours listening to Lily talk about her wooden doll. The ruthless conqueror showed infinite patience to the small child. The royal procession finally reached the iron fortress on the 5th morning. The massive stone walls loomed against the jagged gray mountains. Its dark towers disappeared into the low winter clouds. Heavy iron gates groaned open at the sound of the king's horn. Hundreds of servants and armed guards lined the vast courtyard. They bowed their heads in perfect unison as the carriage rolled to a halt. Smith stepped out onto the polished stone pavement first. He turned and offered his scarred hand to Madison. She hesitated for a brief second before stepping out. She still wore her faded cotton dress and patched wool coat. Her worn leather shoes looked absurd against the spotless marble. Lily clung tightly to Madison's hand while scanning the giant stone walls. Smith did not rush them or ask them to hide. He escorted them proudly toward the grand entrance of the main keep. The great hall was crowded with the most powerful nobles in the realm. Dozens of lords and ladies wore shimmering silk and spun gold. They expected their king to return with a captive general or a forged treaty. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous room. The sovereign ruler of the continent was holding hands with a peasant. Madison kept her chin raised despite her racing heartbeat. She felt the heavy weight of 100 judgmental stares. She heard the malicious whispers circulating among the velvet-clad ladies. Smith ignored the murmurs and led Madison toward the elevated dais. 2 massive thrones carved from solid black obsidian dominated the room. Smith guided Madison to stand directly beside the smaller throne. He turned to face his silent, stunned court. Duke Harrington stepped forward from the front row of nobles. He was a wealthy, arrogant man who controlled the southern trade routes. His chest was covered in meaningless decorative medals. He bowed low, but his eyes carried obvious disdain. "Welcome home, my king," Harrington said smoothly. He glanced pointedly at Madison's stained apron and raw hands. "We did not realize you were bringing common charity to the high table." The great hall went deathly quiet. Harrington smiled a thin, venomous smile. "Perhaps the head steward can find suitable quarters for your servants in the lower levels." Madison felt a flush of humiliation burn her cheeks. She instinctively pulled Lily closer to her side. Smith did not shout or draw his weapon. His reaction was far more terrifying. The temperature in the vast room seemed to drop drastically. Smith stepped down from the dais with slow, deliberate movements. His heavy boots clicked against the stone floor like a countdown to execution. He stopped mere inches from the arrogant nobleman. Smith stared down at Harrington with dead, hollow eyes. "You mistake my patience for weakness," Smith whispered. His low voice carried clearly to every corner of the silent hall. Harrington lost his confident smile immediately. He took a nervous step backward. Smith reached out and grabbed the golden chain around the Duke's neck. He did not strike the man. He simply twisted the metal until Harrington choked and fell to his knees. The heavy metals clattered loudly against the stone floor. "This woman is not a servant," Smith declared. He tightened his grip on the golden chain. "She is your queen." The nobles held their breath in collective terror. Smith dragged the struggling Gluck across the floor toward the dais. He forced Harrington to halt directly at Madison's worn leather shoes. "You value your silken clothes and your noble lineage," Smith said coldly. He looked down at the gasping Duke. "I strip you of your southern lands effective immediately." Harrington let out a pathetic whimper of protest. "I seize your merchant fleets and your gold reserves," Smith continued. He released the golden chain and let the broken man collapse. "You will leave this fortress with nothing but the clothes on your back." Smith turned his dark gaze toward the rest of the trembling court. "Anyone else who questions her place will share his fate." He placed a hand on the pommel of his broadsword. "Or you will meet my blade." The threat of absolute retribution hung heavy in the air. No one dared to make a sound or broke eye contact with the floor. Smith had decimated an arrogant bloodline in less than a minute. He had reduced the most powerful lord in the realm to a weeping beggar. Smith turned his back on the disgraced Duke. He walked up the stone steps and stopped beside Madison. His malevolent aura faded the second he looked at her. He reached up and unclasped his heavy fur mantle. He draped the dark, expensive material over Madison's small shoulders. The heavy fur covered her patched coat and ratted dress entirely. "Take your seat," Smith told her gently. Madison looked at the black obsidian throne. She looked at the wealthy nobles now bowing deeply toward her. She slowly sat down on the velvet cushion. Smith remained standing right beside her chair. He acted as her personal guard rather than her ruler. Lily peeked out from behind the large throne. The little girl pointed at the weeping Duke on the floor. "He is very rude, Mama," Lily observed loudly. A few terrified nobles flinched at the child's voice. Smith let out a sudden, genuine laugh. The unexpected sound shocked the royal court even more than his wrath. "Yes, little one," Smith agreed warmly. "He is very rude. And now he is very poor." Smith ordered his royal guards to drag Harrington out of the hall. He then dismissed the rest of the assembly with a careless wave of his hand. The nobles scrambled to exit the great hall as quickly as possible. They understood the brutal hierarchy of the Iron Fortress now. The king belonged to the widow, and the widow belonged to the king. The massive wooden doors closed, leaving the three of them alone. Madison let out a long breath she had been holding. She traced the smooth armrest of the obsidian throne. She had spent years scrubbing floors and counting copper coins. Now she commanded the wealth of an entire continent. Smith knelt on the steps before her throne. He did not look like a tyrant to her. He just looked like a tired man who finally found his home. "They will never disrespect you again," Smith promised. Madison reached out and touched his scarred cheek. "You did not have to ruin him," she said softly. "I would ruin the world if it made you smile," Smith replied without hesitation. He took her hand and kissed her raw knuckles. He stood up and offered his arm to her. "Come," Smith said. "Let me show Lily the library." Madison stood up and wrapped the heavy fur mantle tightly around herself. She took his arm and walked away from the empty thrones. She knew the dark fortress was meant to keep enemies out, but for the first time she realized it was also designed to keep love safely inside. Winter winds battered the high stone towers of the iron fortress. Inside the royal chambers, the air remained warm and heavy with the scent of burning cedar. Madison woke up in a bed large enough to sleep a dozen soldiers. She stared up at the crimson velvet canopy above her head. She slowly ran her hand over the fine silk sheets. She still instinctively expected to feel the rough wool blankets of her old life. Lily slept peacefully in the center of the massive mattress. The child had not coughed a single time since they left the borderlands. Madison slipped out of bed without making a sound. Her bare feet sank into the thick rugs covering the cold stone floor. She walked toward the heavy oak wardrobe resting against the far wall. She bypassed the dozens of gowns made from spun gold and fine lace. She reached for her faded cotton dress from Hookhaven. A large hand gently covered her wrist before she could touch the worn fabric. Smith stood directly behind her. He wore a dark tunic and his heavy iron sword belt. "Burn that dress," Smith said quietly. Madison looked over her shoulder at his serious expression. "It reminds me of who I am," she told him. "It reminds me of a world that failed you," he replied. He pulled the cotton dress from the wooden hanger and tossed it into the hearth fire. The dry fabric caught the flames immediately and turned to ash. Smith reached into the wardrobe and pulled out a deep emerald gown. He held the heavy velvet fabric against her shoulders. "You are the sovereign of this fortress now," he said. "You must wear armor just like the rest of us." Madison understood the truth in his words. The capital was a different kind of battlefield. Knives here were hidden behind patronizing smiles and polite curtsies. Later that afternoon, Lady Genevieve arrived at the royal chambers. She brought 4 nervous seamstresses to prepare Madison for the upcoming wedding. Genevieve was the wife of the master of coins. She possessed vast generational wealth and a deeply cruel spirit. She smiled at Madison with cold, calculating eyes. "Stand still, my dear," Genevieve instructed. The seamstresses draped yards of white silk over Madison's arms. "We must hide those terrible calluses before the ceremony," the noblewoman added. Genevieve examined Madison's raw hands with obvious disgust. The king has always possessed such strange tastes in his spoils of war. Madison kept her posture rigid and her face completely blank. She remembered the harsh lessons of the borderlands. Showing pain only invited more severe attacks. "Your hands look like they belong in the scullery, not on a throne," Genevieve continued. She pinned a delicate lace veil near Madison's shoulder. "But I suppose commoners rarely know how to care for themselves." The heavy wooden door to the chamber swung open. Smith stepped into the room. The 4 seamstresses immediately dropped to their knees in terror. Genevieve offered a deep, exaggerated curtsy. Smith ignored the noblewoman entirely. He walked directly to Madison and inspected the white silk gown. He noticed the tense line of Madison's jaw. He looked down at her bare hands resting against the fabric. Smith turned his dark gaze toward Lady Genevieve. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Did you find a flaw in the Queen's appearance, Genevieve?" Smith asked. His voice was dangerously calm. Genevieve swallowed hard and maintained her polite smile. "I was merely suggesting some rose oil for her skin, my king," she lied smoothly. "The harsh labor of her past has left unpleasant marks." Smith closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Genevieve backed into the stone wall. Smith did not touch her. He reached into his leather pouch instead. He pulled out a heavy gold ring bearing the royal crest. It was the master signet of the royal treasury. Smith turned his back on the trembling noblewoman. He walked back to Madison. He took her scarred right hand gently in his own. He slid the heavy gold ring onto her index finger. The metal felt incredibly cold against her warm skin. "This ring commands every gold reserve on the continent," Smith announced clearly. He kept his eyes focused entirely on Madison. "It controls the taxation of the trade routes and the funding of the noble estates." He finally looked back at Lady Genevieve over his shoulder. The noblewoman had turned a ghastly shade of pale. Her husband's entire fortune relied on royal grants. "My wife's hands built a life from nothing," Smith stated. He stepped back and crossed his arms over his broad chest. "If anyone finds her hands displeasing, the Queen has the authority to cut off their royal funding forever." He tilted his head slightly. "Starting with the Master of Coins." Genevieve dropped to her knees on the thick rock. Her expensive silk skirts piled around her. Panic completely replaced her previous arrogance. "Forgive me, my queen," Genevieve begged. She stared at the gold ring on Madison's finger with sheer terror. "I spoke out of turn." Madison looked down at the weeping noblewoman. She felt the immense weight of the signet ring on her hand. She realized Smith had not just given her wealth. He had handed her the ultimate weapon to defend herself in his absence. "Leave the dresses," Madison ordered in a steady voice. She pointed toward the heavy wooden door. "Get out of my chambers." Genevieve scrambled to her feet and fled the room without looking back. The 4 seamstresses followed her in complete silence. Smith watched the heavy door close firmly behind them. He walked over to a silver basin and poured a cup of water. "You wield power well," he told Madison. Madison touched the heavy ring. "I prefer an iron poker," she admitted honestly. Smith let out a low rumble of laughter. "The ring is much more effective against cowards," he assured her. He set the silver cup down on the table. "Where is Lily?" he asked. "She wandered off toward the east wing after breakfast," Madison replied. Smith nodded and left the chamber to find the child. He navigated the winding stone corridors with familiar ease. He found Lily inside the vast royal library. The room held thousands of ancient leather-bound texts on tall wooden shelves. Tall, stained-glass windows overlooked the frozen mountain peaks. Lily sat on the stone floor near a roaring hearth. She held a massive book on her small lap. She stared intently at the intricate ink drawings of old war machines. Smith sat down heavily on the floor right beside her. He did not care about ruining his dark tunic with dust. Lily pointed a small finger at the bold black letters on the page. "What does this say?" Lily asked. Smith looked at the complex military text. "It says retribution," Smith answered. He pointed to the next long word on the parchment. "And that one says conquest." Lily frowned at the difficult words. "I want to learn how to read," she stated firmly. Smith remembered the crude charcoal note she had hidden in his saddlebag. Those few uneven letters had literally saved his life. "Then I will teach you," Smith promised. He gently took the heavy military book from her lap. He set it aside on the stone floor. He stood up and pulled a simple book of poetry from a lower shelf. He sat back down and opened the book to the first page. "We will start with something beautiful instead," he said. Lily leaned against his massive arm. She followed his rough, scarred finger as it traced the letters. Madison stood quietly in the library doorway. She watched the deadly warlord patiently sound out vowels for her daughter. She saw the gentle concentration on his scarred face. She watched Lily lean her head against his broad shoulder in total trust. The winter storm raged violently outside the fortress walls. It could not touch the warmth growing inside the library. Madison pressed her hand against her chest. Her heart felt dangerously full. The king had conquered the world with blood and iron. but he had surrendered his entire soul to a widow and a fatherless child. She turned and walked back to the royal chambers to prepare for the wedding. She did not need a dress made of spun gold to feel like a queen anymore. Thousands of thick wax candles illuminated the cavernous royal cathedral. The heavy scent of burning myrrh masked the cold dampness of the stone walls. Hundreds of nobles packed into the heavy wooden pews. They wore their finest silks and displayed their ancestral jewels. Total silence ruled the massive room. Fear kept the courtiers perfectly still. Smith stood at the high altar wearing a tunic of spun black wool. He did not wear ceremonial golden armor or a decorative cape. He kept his iron broadsword strapped firmly to his waist. A sovereign did not disarm for anyone. Heavy wooden doors groaned open at the far end of the nave. Madison stepped into the flickering candlelight. She did not walk with the timid steps of a borderland widow. She moved with the steady grace of a woman who had survived starvation and assassins. She wore the deep emerald velvet gown. No intricate lace hid the calluses on her hands. The heavy gold signet ring caught the candlelight on her right hand. Lily walked closely beside her mother. The little girl wore a matching emerald dress and carried her wooden wolf. Smith felt a strange tightness in his throat. He had watched enemy fortresses collapse and entire armies surrender. None of those victories moved him like the sight of his family walking toward him. Madison reached the high altar and stopped facing Smith. She looked past his facial scars and saw only the man who split firewood in her yard. The high priest stepped forward from the shadows of the altar. He wore elaborate white robes embroidered with silver threads. He belonged to an ancient bloodline that despised commoners. Some bitter nobles had bribed the priest to subtly humiliate the new bride. The priest raised his hands to begin the sacred rite. His voice echoed loudly off the vaulted stone ceiling. He spoke of divine duty and royal lineage. He turned his cold eyes toward Madison. "Do you swear to serve your king with quiet obedience?" the priest asked loudly. "Do you accept your place as a humble vessel for his royal legacy?" A faint murmur rippled through the wooden pews. The nobles instantly recognized the altered vows. These were the vows given to foreign hostages. Madison tightened her jaw but kept her expression completely neutral. She prepared to swallow her pride for the sake of peace. Smith did not let her answer. The metallic shriek of his broadsword leaving its scabbard shattered the sacred silence. Several nobles gasped and stood up in sheer panic. Smith pointed the heavy iron tip directly at the high priest's throat. The priest froze with his hands still raised in the air. "You read the wrong scroll," Smith stated in a deadly whisper. He pressed the cold steel a millimeter closer to the priest's skin. "Read the sovereign oath." The priest swallowed nervously and looked at the sharp blade. "My king, that oath is reserved only for a ruling monarch," the priest stammered. "It has not been spoken since the era of the twin sovereigns." Smith did not move his sword. "Read it," Smith commanded, "or I will find a priest who can." The high priest visibly trembled under the king's murderous gaze. He quickly unrolled an ancient parchment resting on the altar. He cleared his throat and avoided looking at the audience. "Do you swear to rule this realm with iron and justice?" the priest asked Madison. His voice shook with genuine terror now. "Do you accept this crown as a commander of armies and a master of gold?" Madison looked at the sharp blade protecting her honor. She looked at the fierce devotion blazing in Smith's dark eyes. He was not giving her a title. He was giving her half of his entire world. "I swear it," Madison answered with absolute certainty. Smith finally lowered his sword and slid it back into its sheath. He picked up a heavy crown resting on a velvet cushion. It was not made of fragile gold or delicate pearls. The crown was forged from dark iron and embedded with raw diamonds. Smith placed the heavy metal carefully upon Madison's head. "Kneel," Smith ordered the court. He did not raise his voice, but the command carried lethal weight. Every noble, knight, and servant in the cathedral dropped to their knees instantly. The high priest fell to the stone floor right beside the altar. Only Smith, Madison, and Lily remained standing in the vast space. Smith took Madison's hands in his own. "You bow to no one," Smith told her quietly. "Not even to me." The grand bells of the iron fortress began to ring. The heavy sound echoed across the snow-covered mountains. The wedding feast lasted long into the winter night. Torches blazed along the stone walls of the great hall. Servants carried massive platters of roasted venison and spiced wine. Smith kept Madison close to his side at the high table. He poured her wine and cut her meat himself. He ignored the wealthy lords attempting to curry his favor. Lord Blackwood approached the high table with a silver goblet. He was an ambitious man who controlled the eastern iron mines. He bowed respectfully to Smith, but offered only a slight nod to Madison. "My king, we must discuss the new tax levies before the spring thaw," Blackwood said. Smith did not even look up from his plate. He pointed his eating knife casually toward Madison. "Speak to the Queen," Smith ordered. "She holds the royal signet ring." Blackwood frowned and looked at Madison's calloused hands. He clearly doubted her ability to understand complex trade mathematics. "My queen, the Eastern mines require a reduction in royal taxes to survive the winter," Blackwood lied smoothly. Madison set down her silver cup and looked the lord directly in the eye. She remembered the harsh winters in Oakhaven. She remembered the exact cost of a single sack of grain. "The iron trade has seen record profits for 3 consecutive years," Madison stated calmly. Blackwood stiffened in surprise. "If your mines cannot afford the current tax, perhaps the crown should seize them entirely," she continued. She tapped the heavy gold ring against the wooden table. "I will gladly replace you with someone who knows how to manage a ledger." Blackwood turned completely pale and bowed deeply. "That will not be necessary, Your Grace," he stuttered quickly. He retreated into the crowd without another word. Smith let out a low, proud laugh. He leaned over and kissed her temple in front of the entire court. "You are more dangerous than I am," he murmured. "I only learned from the best," she replied with a small smile. Lily sat on a thick cushion between them. She ignored the political maneuvering entirely. She focused on feeding small pieces of bread to a royal hunting hound resting at Smith's feet. The massive beast allowed the little girl to pull its ears without a single growl. Smith spent the rest of the evening carving a small wooden horse for Lily. The little girl eventually fell asleep on a pile of fur blankets near the hearth. Madison watched the firelight dance across Smith's focused face. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The long day of political theater finally ended after midnight. The heavy oak doors of the royal bedchamber closed behind them. The sudden silence of the room was a welcome relief. Smith walked over to the hearth and stoked the dying fire. Madison unclasped her heavy velvet cloak and draped it over a chair. She reached up and carefully removed the iron crown from her head. She placed it on the carved wooden table. Smith turned around and watched her. He crossed the room and stood right in front of her. He reached out and gently chased the line of her jaw. "Did I frighten you today?" Smith asked softly. Madison leaned into his warm touch. "You frightened the priest," she replied. Smith rested his forehead against hers. "He tried to make you small," Smith said. "I will never allow anyone to diminish you." Madison moved her hands to his broad chest. She felt the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. "You have given me too much," she whispered. "I gave you exactly what you deserve," he answered. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his solid frame. He buried his face in her dark hair and breathed in her scent. He smelled sweet bread and winter pine instead of blood and smoke. Madison held him just as tightly.
She realized the terrifying warlord needed comfort more than she did. He had carried the brutal weight of survival his entire life. He had trusted no one until a little girl handed him a strip of linen in an alley. Madison tilted her head up and kissed him. It was a slow, deep kiss devoid of urgency or violence. It carried the profound weight of mutual salvation. Smith kissed her back with desperate reverence. His massive hands moved gently down her back. He treated her like she was the most precious artifact in the realm. He finally pulled back slightly to look at her face. "I spent my life destroying things," Smith confessed in a rough whisper. He rested his large hand against her cheek. "Help me build something instead." Madison smiled and placed her hand over his. "We already started," she told him. She pointed toward the adjoining room where Lily was sleeping. Smith looked at the closed door and smiled. He picked Madison up effortlessly. He carried her toward the massive bed with its crimson canopy. The wind howled brutally against the fortress walls outside. It could not breach the heavy stone. The violence of the world remained locked outside that door. They had finally built a sanctuary that no Arno could ever destroy.
15 harsh winters had passed since the king brought a baker to the iron fortress. Smith stood by the tall glass window of the high tower. He watched the heavy snow bury the jagged peaks of the northern mountains. His dark hair now carried streaks of iron gray at the temples. The brutal scars on his face had faded into pale lines over the years. He wore a simple tunic of dark wool instead of heavy battle armor. Madison walked softly across the thick carpets of the royal bedchamber. She wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. Smith leaned back into her embrace and let out a long breath. Time had only sharpened Madison's quiet beauty and undeniable authority. She ruled the continental treasury with a brilliant mind and a steady hand. The kingdom had not seen a single famine since she took the throne. "The foreign delegations have gathered in the Great Hall," Madison said softly. Smith placed his large hands over hers. "Let them wait in the cold," he replied. "King Alistair brought 300 armed guards to our gates," she warned him. Smith turned around and looked down into his wife's calm eyes. Alistair was the arrogant young ruler of the Eastern Territories. The boy king sought to expand his borders through intimidation and forced treaties. "His guards will freeze in the courtyard while he begs for an audience," Smith stated. He offered his arm to Madison. "We should go down and see how our daughter handles a siege." Madison smiled and took his arm without hesitation. They walked slowly down the winding stone staircase toward the throne room. The great hall was packed with nervous diplomats and wealthy lords. Hundreds of torches cast flickering shadows against the high stone ceiling. Smith and Madison did not walk toward the twin obsidian thrones. They stood quietly in the dark archway of the side entrance. They watched the center of the vast room with quiet pride. Lily stood alone on the raised dais before the thrones. The little girl from the alley was now 20 years old. She wore a tailored tunic of deep crimson and black leather. A finely forged broadsword rested comfortably at her hip. She possessed Smith's imposing posture and Madison's calculating gaze. King Alistair marched down the center aisle with a dozen foreign knights. The young monarch wore excessive gold jewelry and carried a jeweled rapier. He stopped at the base of the dais and looked up at Lily. He did not bother to bow. "I demand an audience with your father, Princess," Alistair announced loudly. His voice echoed with arrogant entitlement. "The king is busy," Lily answered in a smooth, unbothered tone. "He left the border negotiations to me." Alistair let out a sharp laugh of disbelief. "I do not negotiate with young girls," he sneered. His knights chuckled darkly behind him. "I brought 10,000 soldiers to your eastern border this morning." A tense silence fell over the gathered nobility. Alistair rested his hand on the pommel of his jeweled sword. "You will accept my hand in marriage today to unite our kingdoms," Alistair declared. or my army will burn your eastern farms to the ground before midnight." He offered a patronizing smile. "Tell your father to surrender his crown or watch his legacy burn." Smith watched from the shadows with a relaxed posture. 15 years ago, he would have severed Alistair's head before the man finished speaking. He would have drowned the eastern territories in fire and blood. He felt Madison squeeze his arm gently. Smith did not reach for his weapon. He waited to see the weapon he and Madison had forged together. Lily walked slowly down the stone steps of the dais. She did not flinch at the threat of a massive invasion. She stopped mere inches from the arrogant young king. "You brought 10,000 men to the Eastern Pass," Lily repeated calmly. Alistair puffed out his chest. "I did," he confirmed. Lily reached into her leather pouch. She pulled out a heavy silver medallion bearing the Eastern royal crest. She dropped the medal onto the stone floor at Alistair's feet. The young king stared at the medallion in sudden shock. It belonged to his highest-ranking general. "I received a raven from our border garrison 2 hours ago," Lily informed him. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that sounded exactly like Smith. "My father's vanguard flanked your army in the narrow ravine before dawn." She kicked the silver medallion closer to his boots. "Your general surrendered without striking a single blow." Alistair turned a sickly shade of pale. His knights instinctively took a nervous step backward. "You have no army waiting for a signal, Alistair," Lily said. She drew her broadsword with a smooth, terrifying hiss of steel. The heavy iron blade caught the torchlight. "You only have the men standing in this room." Lily pointed the tip of her sword directly at Alistair's chest. "And they are standing in my house?" The foreign king raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. His previous arrogance dissolved into pure terror. He realized he had walked directly into a fatal trap. He thought he was hunting an aging tyrant. He did not realize he was facing an entirely new generation of predators. "I withdraw my proposal," Alistair stammered quickly. Lily kept her blade perfectly steady. "You will sign the Northern Trade Agreement before you leave," she ordered. "You will pay triple the standard tariff for the next decade to compensate for my wasted time." Alistair nodded vigorously. "Bring him the parchment," Lily commanded the royal scribes. She finally lowered her sword and sheathed it. She turned her back on the defeated king and walked up the steps. The courtiers in the great hall erupted into hushed whispers of awe. Smith smiled in the shadows. He kissed Madison softly on the cheek. "She is magnificent," Smith whispered. "She had excellent teachers," Madison replied. They turned away from the hall and walked up the spiral stairs. They did not need to supervise the coin anymore. Their daughter held the realm firmly in her hands. The winter sun began to set behind the jagged mountains. Smith walked out onto the high stone battlements of the fortress. The freezing wind whipped his dark cloak around his legs. He rested his hands on the cold stone parapet. He looked down at the sprawling city thriving beneath his protection. Footsteps echoed softly against the stone walkway. Lily walked out onto the balcony and stood beside him. She did not speak immediately. They shared a comfortable silence, forged by years of mutual understanding. Alistair signed the treaty and fled the valley, Lily finally reported. Smith nodded without looking away from the horizon. "You handled him perfectly," Smith told her. Lily leaned against the stone wall. "I thought you would be angry that I did not execute him," she admitted. Smith turned his head to look at his daughter. He remembered the bloody alleyway in Oakhaven. He remembered the endless cycle of violence that used to define his existence. "Dead men cannot pay trade tariffs," Smith said pragmatically. He reached out and placed his heavy hand on her shoulder. "Your mother taught me that gold builds stronger walls than bones ever could." Lily smiled and rested her hand over his. She reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small object and placed it on the stone parapet. It was the little wooden wolf Smith had carved for her 15 years ago. The wood was worn smooth from years of being held. "I kept it," Lily told him quietly. "It reminded me that strength does not always have to be cruel." Smith stared at the simple wooden toy. A profound weight of emotion tightened his chest. He had conquered 100 cities and slaughtered thousands of enemies. None of those victories meant anything compared to the woman standing beside him. He reached to his waist and unclasped his heavy sword belt. He held the ancient iron broadsword in his hands. It was the weapon that forged an empire. It was the symbol of his absolute authority over the continent. Smith held the heavy blade out to Lily. "It is time," Smith declared. Lily looked at the legendary sword with wide eyes. She knew exactly what this gesture meant. "I am not ready to rule alone," she whispered. "You will never be alone," Smith assured her. "But I have fought my wars." He pressed the leather scabbard into her hands. "It is your turn to protect the peace." Lily closed her fingers around the heady hilt. She felt the immense weight of the legacy she was inheriting. She did not shrink away from it. She stood tall and secured the weapon to her own belt. Madison stepped out onto the balcony from the warm interior. She held 2 thick fur cloaks against the winter chill. She draped one over Lily's shoulders and the other over Smith. Madison stood between them and took both of their hands. They looked out over the darkening mountains as the first stars appeared. Smith felt the calluses on Madison's palm. He felt the cold iron of the sword resting against his daughter's hip. The violent abyss of his past had finally closed forever. He was no longer a lonely tyrant waiting for a knife in the dark. He was a father. He was a husband. He was home. This story really stayed with me. It reminds us that true strength isn't about fighting the world, but having the courage to finally lay down your sword for love. If Smith and Madison's journey touched your heart today, please subscribe to the channel, and I would absolutely love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Leave your city or country in the comments below and tell me how this ending made you feel. I read every single one. See you in the next story.